But that was a generation that they never dreamt as they were coming up, as they were growing up, they never dreamt of shoveling snow in New Jersey and working in a factory. That was never on their radar screen, right? They never said, well, forget everything we've done here. One day we're going to hand it over to the government and we're going to leave with the clothes on our backs. We have to learn a new language. No, no, they had other aspirations and it was taken from them so, so quickly.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself, actually. Tony, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, my friend. First of all, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to join you on your podcast. So yeah, my name is Tony Hernandez. I'm the creator of the Immigrant Archive Project. Um, um, I was the CEO and co-founder of Latino Broadcasting Company, which was a wired radio network specializing in sports and entertainment in the U.S. Hispanic market. And for the last, I guess since 2008, I've dedicated a very, very good chunk of my time to documenting, sharing immigrant stories, immigrant narratives from folks that sort of cover the entire spectrum of society, right? From professionals to single moms and members of Congress, homeless people, corporate CEOs, college students, you name it. Yeah.
Yeah. And for the listeners who did not check out your podcasts, your recordings and your conversations, it really they should. I mean, you have been an inspiration. Everything you've done around immigrants. So, what is the website again? Um,
The Immigrant
huh?
Archive Project .org.
Okay.
Yeah.
So really, I will also mention that in the podcast because that's through your the things that you did, we got to know each other. I reached out and yeah, it's really beautiful. And whenever I have a day like, oh, I don't want to do and all, and the conversations are fine, but the editing and stuff, it's taking so long. And then I think about you and said, you know, he has done more than 3,000. You have done 300 plus. So you still have to go on, Maurice. So then I go again. So it's great talking with you today, Tony. I know your background story a bit. I still would like to ask you if you can share it with my listeners. And your story started in Cuba, right? And you're based now in the US. So tell us about it.
It did. I am now in South Florida, in Miami, but by way of Havana, Cuba, which means that I'm in the majority here in Miami. By the way, most people are Cubans who wound up here. At least it certainly feels that way. Yeah, so I was born in Havana in 1962, shortly after Castro had come to power. Right, he came to power in 1959, so just a few years had gone by. And by then, things had already drastically changed on the island. Freedoms were curtailed. Private property was no longer a thing. Um, Many of the largest businesses had been nationalized. You weren't free to travel like you were before. And then this is something I've shared with you before, but I think it'll be of value to new listeners on your podcast.
Mhm.
Um, Things got so bad that I guess I was just a toddler, probably 2, 3 years old. I had developed a severe calcium deficiency. And our pediatrician basically told my parents, look, the kid needs more milk, right? That's the bottom line. But milk was one of the many things that had been rationed in Cuba at the time. So my father did what I think most fathers would do. He went to the black market, purchased 2 liters of milk, and for that he was thrown in prison. If you can imagine someone
Mm,
buying, not stealing, buying 2 liters of milk for a child with calcium deficiency and winding up in prison, it was that sort of absurd life on the island. And I can say that I was very, very fortunate that we were able to leave by the time I was 5. So although I was born in Cuba, I've been here most of my life. Right, I arrived as a kindergarten student. I'm now a 64-year-old man, but that experience and having lived through it, um, no doubt, when you look at my body of work, has influenced me both professionally and personally on multiple levels.
mhm. Yeah. And and can you tell a little bit about the journey then from Cuba to, because you were fleeing, right? It was not that you were.
No, no, we were fortunate. My grandparents did flee. My grandparents
Okay.
boarded a very small boat under cover of night
Uh-huh.
with a very small group of friends and family. Um, my mother decided not to go on the journey. I think I was maybe 2 years old at the time. She didn't want to risk my life at sea. But they made a very harrowing journey to the U.S. They were lost at sea for several days. They were picked up by a Coast Guard. This was back in a time when, our laws were a little more benevolent, our immigration laws. So they weren't returned back to Cuba. They were brought to the United States, and they started a new life. So when we arrived in '67, that's why we wound up in Hackensack, New Jersey. Right, my maternal grandparents, that old line from Billy Joel, a house out in Hackensack, is that all you get for your money? That's all we got for our money. We went up to Hackensack, New Jersey, and joined my grandparents. Um, and it was a unique time, right? It was
Uh,
67. There weren't a lot of Spanish speaking people in the US, certainly none in Hackensack, New Jersey. I still look back at school and I was the only kid that spoke Spanish in my class.
uh,
Nobody else spoke Spanish. Um, I would imagine you're hard pressed to find a class in Hackensack, New Jersey now where everybody doesn't speak Spanish, including the American kids, right? So yeah, it was a much different time, um, but it was a time where there was a lot of optimism.
mhm.
There were factory jobs in America, right? So someone like my father with no English skills, with a limited education, was able to, in short order, have not one job but two. Right, he was working two full-time jobs 7 days a week in order to feed the family. So it was an interesting time. There was a lot of turmoil, right? You had the civil rights era, you had the war in Vietnam, but as I mentioned earlier, you had a ton of factory jobs, particularly in New Jersey, and that's why I think a lot of the Cuban immigrants wound up in that area. Right, there was a lot of work, which there really wasn't here in Miami. In Miami, I think the best you could aspire to was, maybe to be a busboy at a hotel in South Beach, and there weren't that many hotels in South Beach, so most people figured out a way to, chase the work, which is what every immigrant family does, and that's certainly what we did. And 9 months, I think it was, after our arrival, my sister was born, the first American-born family member, and the two of us, grew up in this sort of hybrid life, right, where everything outside the house was sort of American mainly, and everything from the door into the apartment was Cuba 1958. The
Uh,
music that my parents listened to, we weren't allowed to speak English in the home. Not out of disrespect to the country, on the contrary, as a way of keeping our native language alive. Right, very very proud to be American, very appreciative of the opportunities. Um, I mean, just to put that into perspective, the first thing my father did when he arrived is he signed up for selective service,
mm,
right? He explained that he had military experience. He had fought against Castro, and if the country needed him, take him to Vietnam. He knows how to fight, and he's at fighting age. And they said, no, thank you. You have a 5-year-old son, and you need to get your life underway. So they never called on him. But
mm,
and that wasn't just him. I think that was something that was very common among young. He was 30 at the time, among fairly young men coming from Cuba at that time. I know Gloria Estefan's father volunteered for service, and they called on him, and he spent time in Vietnam
Hmm.
with a wife and young kids here in the States. So yeah, it was a community that was very, very appreciative, and understood the opportunity that we had after our own country turned its back on us, and really gave us absolutely no opportunities if we weren't in line with the current thinking and the
Mhm.
platform of the Castro regime. So there was no place for us in Cuba. So we made a new home here, and I think we've been pretty good for the country. I really do. A lot of young, hardworking blue collar families wound up educating their children and their grandchildren, and it's a community that, like most immigrant communities, has given back far more than they received.
Tony, thanks for that. And what I would like the listeners then to understand, so your grandparents, they came by sea and they fled, but you and your parents, you went through another route, right? And
Yeah.
can you tell a little bit about that, because not everybody's familiar how that.
Yeah, not everybody's familiar with that. Thank you. Yeah, there was what were called the freedom flights, and the freedom flights went on from the '60s to the very early '70s. And if you had a family member in the states that could petition on your behalf and show that, you would have a place to stay, right? They would look after you for a period of time until you found work. There was a chance that you would be allowed to travel. Not every family that they petitioned was allowed to leave. Some families were separated at the airport. Right, the husband can leave, but the wife has to stay, or vice versa. Or the one child can leave, one child has to stay. But we were fortunate. We boarded a flight. We landed in Miami, and that's where our story and the story of Church World Service intersects.
Yeah.
And we've had this conversation before. Uh, but Church World Service really was doing, no pun intended, God's work at the time. They were the ones who literally handed us a check for $100 to help us get on our feet, and they paid for our flight from Miami to Newark Airport to reunite with my grandparents. I still remember coming out of Newark Airport and seeing that large Budweiser sign, with the smoke all around it, because it was November, and November of '67 was a particularly cold month. And every time I land in the airport, I'm reminded of that 5-year-old kid arriving in New Jersey for the first time. But it was just a grand gesture, and it was part of very important work that they were doing, and not just relocating folks in New Jersey, but throughout the entire country, you know. And I'm very thankful that my mother had the foresight to keep records of everything that was part of that journey, And when you reached out to me years back with this idea of the first annual John Backer, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes, yes, correct.
humanitarian
Yeah.
award. um, I asked her, I said, "Hey, hang on a second, dig through your files, right?" Because I mean, she kept everything. I
Yeah.
know we literally have the boarding passes that we used on that flight that Church
Wow.
World Service paid for between
Yeah.
Miami and New Jersey. And lo and behold, there it was, and it was the exact same logo. And I was just floored, man. Like all these years later, you have someone reaching out to me from the same organization. It was a very emotional moment. It was a beautiful
Yeah.
moment. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
No, and they're happy that we were able to do that and make the connection. And I think it was a great event that was organized, and to have your parents also there, right? Wonderful.
They're the ones
And
that deserve the credit, not their son. But it was
yeah,
really wonderful to have them there. No, really, I mean that
yeah,
sincerely.
yeah,
They're the ones. That was without a doubt, our greatest generation. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And again, CWS Church World Service was not the only organization who were doing this type of
Mhm.
work. There were several organizations, and many of them later went into refugee resettlement programming, etc. And a program that is now being basically dismantled, unfortunately. Um, but maybe we can talk about later about the situation now, and the situation of migration within this country. But before we go there, Tony, what I wanted to ask you is bringing it a little bit to, why I started this podcast, which, I had to do with a 100-mile walk that I started in 2012. And then during COVID, I couldn't walk. So then I came up with this virtual walk that we are doing then also today. But every immigrant story begins with someone taking an extra mile, right? Often literally. So, what is the story in your own family that first made you realize that these stories needed to be preserved?
It's a wonderful, wonderful question. What sort of crystallized this vision for me was
Hmm.
many years ago when I first watched one video in a series produced by Steven Spielberg, a series called Survivors of the Shoah. And after he wrapped Schindler's List, he understood the importance of documenting as many Holocaust survivor stories as possible, because obviously, as every day goes by, there's one less, and eventually there will be none left. So he undertook. I mean, he's Steven Spielberg, right? He undertook that challenge, and he and his team spent years documenting Holocaust survivor stories on every continent. So the first time I saw a couple speaking on camera, a switch kind of went off and clicked, and I understood. Okay, not that I'm comparing immigrant stories to Holocaust survivor stories. That's not the case, um, but understood the value of preserving these stories, right? So that these stories that I grew up around, that I lived through, um, will be there for my children's children's generation. And perhaps a little naively, because I'm not Steven Spielberg, I don't have access to his network or his capital, but said, you know what? We have a radio network. Let's start recording some stories on a digital handheld recorder. And after maybe documenting a dozen or so conversations, I realized it was much, much bigger than just an audio project. And I shouldn't say just an audio project, because there are beautiful audio projects, but I felt like there's an element of the story that's missing unless you're able to see the protagonist, right? There's so much that goes unsaid that can be read in their body language and in the way they carry themselves. Um, the dignity, the power, the all of it. So after about a dozen stories, we started to film them on two cameras, and at first they were small digital cameras, and for many many years now we shoot everything on red. Um, in fact, we shot an interview with the president of Marvel Studios at the time, Victoria Alonso, in her office in at Disney. And when we walked in, she said, "Wait a second, you guys film your interviews on the same cameras we film our superhero films on?" I said, yeah, yeah, we do. We take this seriously. We want to make sure that these stories can hold up over time, and they don't look like, um, that they hold up, right? That they
Yeah,
look good
yeah,
20, 30 years from now.
yeah.
So yeah, so that's what we've done. And as you mentioned earlier, we've amassed a collection of thousands of hours of content. Yeah.
Yeah, unbelievable. Um, so, was there a particular conversation that changed the direction of your life?
I think it was a series of conversations,
Okay.
a series of experiences, um, growing up, as I've often said, having been blessed to
Hmm.
have grown up in an immigrant community. And you see the rhetoric around immigrant communities, they talk about immigrant communities as though they're a bad thing. They're the most beautiful communities in the country. People look out for each other, you
Uh-huh.
know. Most people in the community are hardworking, are just looking to keep food on the table and give their children a better opportunity. That was always my experience. I didn't have a bad experience in an immigrant neighborhood. I didn't. You know, I knew plenty of people who lived in more affluent neighborhoods that were dealing with a lot bigger problems than we were. I don't remember anybody running a Ponzi scheme in my community, right? I don't remember anybody having been, sexually abused or trafficked or, none of that, right? There was none of that. Um, so yeah, having seen the reality of it, and then at one point in our country's history, after um, Obama was elected, there was a rise of, you know, far right extremist voices, and they found a place on network television. And I remember what I was hearing was just flying in the face of my own experience. People, um, like so many that I grew up around, were being vilified unnecessarily. Um, so naively, perhaps I decided that maybe it would be a good time to share those dinner table conversations that I grew up around, right? Because that's what we would hear. That's what we would listen to, you know. When we got here, when we arrived, right? And they'd relive those moments, and they'd keep a country that was taken from them, so to speak, alive for us. What was life like back in our home country? So we understood that we didn't come from shithole countries. We came from wonderful countries. We came from cultures that are evolved and beautiful and joyful. And we were fortunate to take the best from our culture and the best from American culture, and do what every immigrant group has done since they first arrived here on the Mayflower, right? Take the best of what you brought and the best of what they've got here, and you keep pushing it forward, and you keep getting closer to that perfect union we so like to discuss. Um, and Yeah, so all of that, I think, had to do with it. All of
Hmm.
that had to do with it. Um, taking what was my lived experience, and maybe just adding a little drop of that into the national conversation that I thought was taking a very dangerous turn.
So maybe piggybacking further on that in that whole situation, and you know the conversations that you've had, and maybe as a result, questions that you have been asked. Um, when someone asks you, "Where are you from?" What do you hear behind that question?
Oh, the obvious. You're not from here. You're not from here. you know. So my wife is Irish American, right? When I say Irish American, I mean two generations past, where nobody in the last 80 years in her family, I think, has been to Ireland, but Irish American, so American. I don't recall being anywhere with her and people asking her where she's from. Well, no. But that's just part and parcel. That's just ignorance on display.
Um, if you think about home, what does that mean for you today?
Ah, my family, my family, my family's home. When you're not from here and you're not from there, where are you from? Right? I haven't stepped foot in Cuba since I left in 1967. And I've done this work long enough to understand that if I ever did step foot in Cuba, I'd be reminded by Cubans that have lived in Cuba far longer than I have, that they can tell that I'm not from there by the way I would carry myself, the way I speak, the way I dress, the way I carry myself. And then here I'm reminded that I'm not really from here, because I'm not. So where are we from? And I think there's a sort of beautiful brown flag that all of us wave, who would die for this country, who would put our lives on the line for this country. But we know that we're not really from here, um, because we're reminded often that we're not really from here. So where are we from? I think we inhabit this space and memory and time, not as much as firm ground underfoot.
Maybe going further, piggybacking what you just said. Through all the interviews that you have done, Tony, What have you learned about belonging?
That's a really wonderful question. That's a really wonderful question. And maybe I'm still trying to figure out what belonging actually actually means, right? And I've gotten wonderful examples of it. Um, we interviewed a gentleman who was Obama's poet laureate, Richard Blanco, and he said, you know, up until that day that I delivered the inauguration poem, I'd always thought of myself as Cuban American, right? There was a hyphen, as Cuban American. And that day, the way it washed over me, I realized I have to stop thinking that way. You know, my journey is a quintessentially American story. You know, I am every bit as American as the president, even though I wasn't born here. This is a quintessentially American story, and I do belong. It was sort of like my homecoming, right? It was my homecoming. Um, I think I may still be in search of my own homecoming, to be honest with you.
Yeah, this is stimulating a question. I will ask you later. I have to make a note of that. I would like to go first back to the project. You know, to you. This is about preserving stories, right? Um, do you think storytelling itself is a spiritual act?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, storytelling is nothing more than listening,
Mm.
right? Than listening. Um, you know, you're doing these interviews now. I'm sure you prepare for them. I take the preparation very, very seriously, very seriously. I've only had one interview that I've ever conducted that I just didn't have the luxury of being able to prepare for, and it was one of the most fascinating interviews ever. But I felt, you know, um, it was a very strange thing, because if you're going to spend time with me on camera, if you're going to open your heart and soul and you're going to let us into, and that's what my interviews tend to be about, right? I at the end of many interviews, I'll have the person on camera ask me for a copy of the interview, and then they'll say, of course, and I'll ask them why, even though I know the answer. And inevitably they'll say, because I've shared with you things that I've never told my husband or my wife or my children or my lover, or right. So, you know, you take them places that are very deep and very personal. So if the least I can do is to be very, very prepared by doing my homework and knowing as much about you as I possibly can, right? As I possibly can. So, yeah, storytelling is um, it's about respect and about giving people the space and the sense of um, um, comfort and safety to speak openly about things that we don't normally speak openly about.
Can you maybe share with us um, something that happened that was really totally unexpected because you prepare for yourself, right? You have certain expectations. And as a result of the conversation or you listening, you go into the direction and it will never go probably totally and how you had envisioned it. But what I'm looking for is something that happened as a result of the conversation that was really unexpected. Um, you know, and can you give an example of that if you have experienced something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I have many examples. I have funny examples. I have, you know, I interviewed a migrant farm worker here in South Florida as part of a group of interviews that we were doing, and I wanted farm worker stories. And the last thing I expected to find in one of these migrant farm worker stories was the incredible, incredible story of a very strong, resilient, young, gay Mexican man who said to me, despite the hateful rhetoric around undocumented immigrants, and he was undocumented, despite the fact that, we're living through this nightmare that we're living through, I feel far more, I feel so much more safe here in the US as an undocumented immigrant than I felt in Mexico as a native born gay man. And that was like very, very eye opening, right? So eye opening that it's more dangerous to be an openly gay man in Mexico than an undocumented immigrant in the United States. Um, I wasn't expecting that. That's one of those interviews that stays with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What have those stories taught you about resilience?
Oh, it's everything, 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 Um, I've documented a lot of stories of resilience, right? I mean, from first person narratives, people that have been lost at sea, um, first person narrative, someone that was attending the Nova Festival in Israel when the Hamas attacks happened. And, you know, out of a group of, you know, probably 15, 17 friends, only a couple survived. And she was one of them. Right. So, yeah, resilient stories from arriving here with nothing and being able to get on your feet and educate children to, what the human spirit is willing to go through um, in order to come out the other side. It's tremendous. I had a conversation once with El Duque Hernandez. I don't know if you remember. He was a um, he was a World Series winning pitcher with the New York Yankees, and he had fled on a raft from Cuba and had come to the States shortly before suiting up and playing in a World Series game. And I said to him, I was always floored. And I was at those games because that was part of a World Series during the time that my radio network had the exclusive broadcast rights to Major League Baseball. So we were producing those games. And but we had a chance to have this conversation years later. And I said to him, the one thing that blew me away was how calm and collected you were, right? Just literally had just stepped off a raft, not that much prior to being in a World Series in pinstripes at Yankee Stadium. You know that millions of people are watching you, and yet you were cool on the other side of the pillow. And he turns to me and said, I guess when you've been lost at sea, surrounded by sharks in the middle of the night, you keep that in perspective, and pitching game one of the World Series isn't that big of a deal. So,
Yeah.
sometimes what you need is a little perspective, right?
Yeah.
Like, even if he got beat, he was going to go home and sleep in a comfortable bed that night. Much, much easier night than being lost at sea. So, yeah, you learn so much about resilience from these stories. Um, it's tremendous, and you know, you have to thank God that he doesn't put on our plate what we're capable of bearing, because I think all of us are capable of bearing much, much more than we think.
And well, talking maybe about sleeping and has there been one interview or several interviews that stayed for you for weeks afterwards?
Oh yeah, many,
Mm.
many, 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 many. I don't know if you're aware, but I spent a month in Israel about 8 weeks after the attacks, directing a documentary, and it was really heart wrenching. You know, I conducted 42, 44 interviews in a month, um, and to have story after story of incredible pain and suffering, right? Just incredible, incredible, incredible pain and suffering. It's something that I continue to carry to some degree, but for months afterwards, it was like a heavy coat. You couldn't shake it. You know, I mean, what do you say after sitting across from a 90-year-old man and they burned his daughter and her husband and their children alive. And he's walking you through that. And then before he leaves, he says, Tony, hang on. Before you go, I want to leave you with a joke. And he gives you a joke. And then he walks away. Interviewing a beautiful young woman who was a member of her community security team, who looked like one of my daughters. I mean, she was in her mid 20s, uh, carrying carrying a rifle over her shoulder. Um, and by the time she got done telling me the story, the hug that I received from her, you could tell she was consoling me. She was consoling me. So yeah, the level of strength um, and these, by the way, were all Spanish-speaking people who had emigrated from Latin America to
Mm.
Israel, and that's the reason why I took that project on, right? Why we created that project. They were all immigrant stories, just not immigrants here in the U.S. Yeah, but plenty of other stories that have stayed with me for forever. I interviewed this really remarkable woman who came from Costa Rica with her mom when she was maybe 5 years old, and her mom lost her job, and the two of them were living in a park. They were homeless in a park in Los Angeles, and it was a very hard life. And fast forward to today, she's a Harvard Law School grad and runs a nonprofit for underprivileged girls in LA. You talk about a beautiful sort of full circle story, right? This little girl that was. So before the interview was over, I said, I have to ask you, something tells me that even during those dark moments where you and your mom were homeless in a park, that there had to be one beautiful memory from that time. What was it? And she started to cry. She thanked me for the question. She said, I've never shared this with anyone because no one's ever bothered to ask. She said, I remember my mom had a little transistor radio, and we were in the park one night, and she tunes in a Spanish language station, and some Latin song comes on. He says, Mija, come, I'm going to show you how to dance so that when you're a young lady and a young man invites you to a dance, you'll know how. And she said, and that's how I learned to dance, Tony, under the stars in a park, my homeless mom and I. I'm like, there's beauty even in some of these dark moments, right? There's beauty if you look for it, it's there. And it was enough to bring her to tears many decades later. Um, but yeah, you have people that find a tremendous amount of dignity where others might be crushed by the conditions under which they're living.
Are there common threads that connect people, regardless of where they came from?
Yeah. Maya Angelou was absolutely right. We are more alike than we are unalike.
Hmm.
I can tee up two totally different stories. A young Vietnamese man that I interviewed who escaped from Vietnam and made it to the US, and Ralph de la Vega. Not to keep going back to Cuban stories, but he was a Cuban guy who, came alone as a young boy and became CEO of AT&T. Um, and despite one being from, Asia, the other one from the Caribbean, and one having a career at AT&T, the stories are the same. The stories are the exact same thing. What they went through, what they lived through, their hopes and aspirations. You know, um, at the end of the day, we all want the exact same thing. We all want the same thing. We want to be able to pave the road a little bit so that our children have an easier road than we did. Um, I think those of us that pay attention want to make those that came before us proud of the sacrifices they made, so that as they paved the road for us, right? Um, and we just want to have a sense of purpose to a certain degree, right? So that all of this nonsense makes sense at the end of the day. And I think if we raise our kids right, they would add some measure of a sense of fairness to it, right? A sense of fairness, um, which I've always been a big a big proponent of. You know, since I was a little kid, I was the one that would stand up for the underdog. Um, I've always been willing to take a punch in the face for the underdog. I got no problem. I've been a big defender of the underdog, and I'll die being a defender of the underdog. Yeah.
Huh. Um, yeah, talking a bit, continuing a little bit about, those really deep personal stories that you were able to have. And what if you learned about becoming a better listener?
I think listening has come naturally to me. I don't think I've had to work at listening. Um, that's 90% of this, you know. Um, but what you find when you do this work is how much that's missing in society. When you give someone your undivided attention for an hour or two, um, you build these bonds with perfect strangers. I mean, I don't think there's anyone in the archive, and I'm talking thousands of people, that I could have pick up the phone and, they would gladly take my call and we would have meaningful conversations. And it's simply because they were listened to that day. Simply because they were listened to that day. And I mean listened to, right? Um, I'll give you an idea. When I prepare for an interview, as I told you, I do a deep dive on everyone, right? And I write pages and pages and pages of questions. I mean, pages of questions. And then I sit down with the pages on my lap and I never look at them. I never look at them. If I didn't have them on my lap, I'd feel naked. I have to have them on my lap. But by the time I draft 60 questions for a 1 hour interview that you will never ask 60 questions in a 1 hour interview, never, never. A 4-part documentary, you're not going to get 60 questions in. Uh, but I'll write down 60 questions. And I'll know why I'm asking every single one of those questions. And then it's just a cathartic conversation between two old friends that just happen to have met. So as you're taking me into, which inevitably you will, take me into areas that I hadn't thought of, I'm not busy looking at the next question on the list that's going to take you off that beautiful journey you're about to take us on. I'm not gonna block you from taking us there, right? Then it just becomes a conversation between two friends. But that's all. That's all listening. That's all listening.
Then you're better than I am, Tony, because
No,
my
no, no.
listeners know that the story that I've been sharing is when I started this podcast.
Mhm.
Uh, is it now three years ago or something or more? Um, I realized when I was editing, like, oh, this is so interesting, that I had not really listened to it carefully when I had the conversation. So because I was so busy with either the next question, or oh yeah, yeah, I know where this answer is going. So I really I think I've become better at it, to be honest. So it's
But
now.
but also there are layers to all of this,
Mhm.
right? There really are. Even when you give someone your undivided attention, there's always something else that you pick up on
Mm.
subtly when you watch the interview, detached from it. You're no longer
Yeah, yeah,
across
yeah,
from
yeah.
them. You always will pick. And that doesn't mean you
Hmm.
weren't necessarily listening or you weren't giving them your full attention. It was another layer of something that you latched onto at a later point. That happens a lot. Um, and if I can just add something to it,
Hmm.
as an interviewer, your body language is absolutely key. You know, um, we still have that ability to tell, right? Uh, whether you're really paying attention or whether you're checking out, right? Which is something I hate, is to see interviewers, right? Journalists looking through questions, looking at their watch while they're talking to someone, uh, taking their eyes off of them because something in the background is distracting them. That's
Mm.
horrible. That's horrible. I think it's important if the if your subject is going through a painful experience and reliving a painful experience, they need to see a mirror image of that pain in your face. And I don't mean faking the pain. I mean, man, go on that journey with them. There's no other way to live it if it's not shown on your, you're going to show it. If you're on that journey, you're going to show it. um and then something that I know I don't need to tell you, um when there's some silence in the room, don't be so quick to interrupt the silence. 9 out of 10 times, by not filling in the silence, they will, and they will continue going deeper than they were ready to go before. Yeah, but you know
Now I don't dare to say anything, Tony. No, I totally agree with you. Can I do a little jump? And that is about, um, immigration has become maybe one of the most polarized issues, conversations in many countries, and maybe in every country at the moment. Um, what worries you?
what worries me about immigration becoming as polarizing.
Yeah,
Two things worry me. One, I'm worried for our position in the world. We can't squander human capital. We can't. I don't think there's a country out there that can squander human capital. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. That's exactly what we're doing right now. We don't know where the next inventor of something that will transform humanity will come from. Odds are they're not going to come from the US. Odds are they're not going to come from the US. It'd be a miracle that they come from the US. They come from everywhere. And the moment we stop, and I think we already have, stop being that that magnet that draws the best and the brightest, and those that are willing to, have some grit and determination in order to carve out a better position for themselves and their families, then we're less apt to compete with other countries that do that. And this isn't the only country where a family can arrive and create a better life for themselves. I can think of many countries where a family can do that. So the moment that talent is drawn somewhere else, we're going to be in a tougher and tougher and tougher situation, particularly with the competition we're seeing coming in from China, right? Particularly from China. But China's not the only one that's going to compete with us. So I'm worried for the future of the country. And then I'm worried for, the present of a lot of people in this country, who have done nothing but contribute to the nation, who've worked hard in order to move us in the right direction. While I'm all on board for criminals suffering the consequences of their criminality, um, I'm not sure that having arrived here without the proper documentation and then living a hardworking, um, ethical life deserves the kind of punishment that's being inflicted on them. I think that's a gross overreach. Um, and then the moment you start vilifying, as they have, um, undocumented immigrants, some of that spills over into just immigrants in general. In general. So, as we've seen, how many people have been deported that have had their papers, right? That have had their working papers. Um, but from one day to the next, no, they're showing up for their hearing. They're showing up for their court date because they've done everything according to the book. And no, you're deported. You're put on a plane and you're sent to, you're lucky if they send you back to your own country. Maybe sent to a country you've never set foot in. You don't know the language. You don't have any connections. You don't know anyone. So imagine what that would be like. So to think that that's where we are, it's a horrible, horrible, horrible situation, and no different than a lot of the other things that I disagree with are just. easy points that we're giving up to the competition, right? These are just self-inflicted gunshot wounds. We are hurting our ability to prosper as a nation for no good reason. For no good reason. So those are the things that worry me. Yeah.
And where do you still see hope, Tony?
I see hope in our youth and in our women. That's where I see hope. As I have conversations with people of my children's generation who are in their 20s and 30s, and particularly with women, both young and older, uh, women have done a lot to sort of help steer the ship back on course. Even in my own country, in Cuba, La Dama en Blanco, the ladies in white, who are the widows and the mothers of political prisoners, um, the wives of political prisoners and dissidents, what they've done um, in order to shine a light on all the injustices in Cuba. Uh, I would venture to say is, many times more than what the men have collectively done. So if I have faith in something, I have faith in our youth and in women who I see them pointing out the injustices much more readily than I've seen their male counterparts.
And and what yeah, how did that develop then? What is the yeah, how did it happen? Why are they more equipped or willing or able?
Well, for one thing, they're less susceptible to the manosphere or the brosphere or the Joe Rogan, nonsense and this, cartoonish sort of vision of what it means to be a man. Whether it's Pete Hegseth and that nonsense about, testosterone. It's cartoonish. It's silly. It's silly. I can just imagine what Iranian generals must be thinking, looking at these idiots parading around in tight suits claiming to be macho and that they're going to be brought to the brink of annihilation and that they got to be laughing their asses off. These are very incompetent people, very, very incompetent people who shouldn't be doing what they, should not be in those positions. And I think a lot of the women around us um, see that, see that, and see how their voices have been diminished and how, there are members of that far right fringe that would literally love for them not to be able to vote, to just be quiet and listen to what your husband has to say. And you know, we're past that nonsense. We're past that nonsense. We're not going back to that. I can guarantee you. And the women aren't going to allow it.
What gives me hope is actually the work that you do. I mean, the stories that you allow to be shared and bring them out in the open. What I hope my podcast is contributing to is also that connection, connecting people, showing that, as you mentioned, we might have more in common than we think. And so even if we don't have a lot in common, there might be something that we have in common and that we can connect and we start a dialogue. So
Well,
I've
we we
tried,
we, we excuse me for interrupting.
yeah.
We have to be able to look beyond the surface,
Hmm.
right? Because that's really where we don't share a lot of commonalities, right? I may eat different foods than you, I may listen to different music than you, but all of that is surface nonsense. You get beyond that surface bullshit and you get to the core of who we are. And yes, absolutely. We are identical to one another when you look at what really matters, right? Forget the other stuff, how you dress, how the car you drive, with the neighborhood you live in. That's all nonsense. When you get to the real core values, when you strip away all the other bullshit, yeah, Angela was right. Yeah, yeah,
So we are connected, I call it.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I'm going to connect you with the previous guest. And the
Yeah.
previous guest has a question for you.
My question for the next guest is so simple. It is something that I hear spoken very casually sometimes, but it's what's good? I just love the simplicity of that question of what's good? there is good in the day to day, there's good in a walk, there's good in the world, there's good in your circle of family or loved ones, and it could be a whole lot of things, but what's good? That's my question.
That's
What's good?
good. What's good? That's a good question. That's a good question. That got thrown around a lot. Uh, I don't hear it as much anymore, but that got thrown around a lot for a while. In fact, we used to produce the Latin urban hip hop show, hosted by this fascinating young guy named Frankie Needles. And Frankie would walk into a room, "Hey, what's good?" That was his that was his throwaway line. That was his throwaway line. What's good? I think what's good is what we're doing right now, right? Spending time having a meaningful conversation, you know, sharing and talking about things that matter, staying tied to our humanity, which there's less and less of every day, you know. Um, More and more, the scenes playing out in restaurant is two couples having dinner and nobody's speaking. Everybody's tied to their phones. You know, you got a beautiful situation in front of you, but you got to look at somebody's bullshit pictures from their vacation to Marbella and feel less than because they're, it's so it's so tiring. So this is good. This is good. One of my guilty pleasures in life, um, as you probably know, is enjoying a good cigar. I don't know if you smoke cigars or not. Okay, you don't. I'm not going to encourage you to smoke cigars because I'm going to hear from your doctor and your wife. Um, but as an avid cigar smoker, I can tell you that there are a few places in society like cigar shops. Very, very unique places. I know of no other place like this anywhere. And as I travel, I always find this. I mean, I've been in cigar shops in every city in the country. I've been in cigar shops all throughout the world, and they're all exactly the same. And I don't know what it is about that ritual, but you will have an investment banker, a plumber, a school teacher, a cop, a retired postal worker, and a self made billionaire, and it's kumbaya. And there's respect and there's conversation and nobody's on their phone and everybody, regardless of their opinion, will listen to the other, and everybody walks away friends. I've never heard an argument in a cigar shop. So what's good is this. And hopefully life can start looking more like a cigar shop without the carcinogens in the future, you know?
If you do it in moderation,
There you go. Excess and
it's okay.
moderation.
Yeah. Uh, no,
That's the
I
idea.
before I ask you to come up with a question for the next guest, I do, you know, would like to ask you because if you talk about cigars, people always say, well, Cuban cigars. So, I mean, but for you, somebody who had to leave, you know, your country and the way you look at the country now, are Cuban cigars still the best cigars in the world?
Cuban cigars for a long time was a way to connect
Uh-huh.
with, right? You mentioned earlier, like where are we from, right? You hold a Cuban cigar in your hand. This is from where you're from, right? You're holding something that came out of the ground where you're from. So it had a little bit of a visceral sort of connection for me. Um, that was years ago. As I developed my palate, as I learned more about it, as I grew to understand what I enjoyed, um, I was less enthralled by Cuban cigars. Cuban cigars are nowhere near as good as the stuff I'm smoking these days, and it's for the simple reason that they don't have an owner. It's owned by the state, right? So imagine if your cigars were made by somebody at the U.S. Postal Service, right? Somebody that checks in, checks out. Right? They can't wait for that 3 o'clock whistle to blow and leave. Those are the people that make Cuban cigars. It doesn't have an owner. There's nobody writing her. There's nobody saying, no, no, do not put that in the box because that I'd be mortified if someone were to see that in a box bearing my
Mm,
family name, right?
mhm.
So the stuff that I smoke today doesn't come. It comes from Esteli, Nicaragua. and it's family owned, and it's arguably the Chateau Lafite of cigars. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Uh, okay. Yeah, your question for the next guest, Tony.
I guess if I could ask the question of the next guest, it would be the following: what are you doing today to assure that the childhood version of you one day is proud of you?
Love that. Um, we are almost at the end of our conversation. And as you know, these conversations go fast. I still wanted to piggyback on humor, laughing. Which you came up with that example of that the person that you interviewed at the end, wanted to tell you a joke. Um, when you or your parents talk about Cuba, yeah, what are the stories? And is there still a lot of humor when you, or has that passed? So how is that? Can you?
Oh, there's humor. There's everything. I mean, you deal with the pain through humor, right? Um, and Cubans are humorous people. Cubans are very, very humorous people. The jokes you hear about our reality, for example, there was a joke floating around years ago, which I liked. It says, there's this old guy, years from now, there's this old guy in El Malecon, which is, that beachfront in Havana, and he's looking out over the ocean and he's yelling out, "Send Elion back! Send Elion back!" And this guy stops him and says, "Old man, you're out of your mind. Send Elion back. They sent Elion back years ago." He says, "Shut up, idiot. I'm Elion." So, you know, yeah, there is an element of humor mixed in with, especially for my parents' generation, right? I was just 5 years old. Um, but that was a generation that they never dreamt, as they were coming up, as they were growing up, they never dreamt of shoveling snow in New Jersey and working in a
Mm,
factory. That was never on their radar screen, right? They
mhm.
never said, well, forget everything we've done here. One day we're going to hand it over to the government and we're going to leave with the clothes on our backs. We have to learn a new language. No, no, they had other aspirations. And it was taken from them so, so quickly. So, so quickly, And that's why I think, you know, we need to defend this thing. We need to defend our democracy, right? Because it can turn very, very quickly, very quickly. And Cuba wasn't invaded by a foreign country. The people that locked my father up and threw him in jail for buying 2 liters of milk were other Cubans. Were other Cubans. The people that shot Peretti in Minneapolis, they weren't Vietnamese cats. They weren't Chinese. They weren't Russian. They were Americans. Did it on national television. People stayed relatively quiet about it. So, we're capable of that. We're capable of that. They certainly proved that they were capable of that in Germany. We proved that we were capable of that in Cuba. Are we not? Of course we are. And that's why we need to be so diligent. You know. And I know your question was about something funny, and that wasn't particularly funny, but mixed in with the humor is a reality, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, no. Um, yeah. Before I really thank you and we part for today, um, the, the present situation, the current situation in the U.S. is that changing your project. Do you
Is it
understand what
changing
I'm?
my
Yeah,
project?
because has
Oh.
you? I mean,
You
you
know,
still continue your interviews, right?
yeah,
So has something changed
yeah,
since that?
yeah. Something has changed. And something that I find absolutely heartbreaking is how many people that came and sat with me and shared beautiful stories have reached out and asked me to take their stories down. Please take my story down. And it kills me to do that. And of course, I do. You know, I don't keep anybody's story up against their wishes. That would be criminal. Um, but how sad that we're now participating in the rewriting of history, right? They've made it so uncomfortable. And I can tell you, there's no one that has shared a story that shouldn't share that story. There's no one that shouldn't share that story. They're beautiful stories. They're people that are, we're fortunate to have them as neighbors. We really are. We really are. Um, I said, I run a risk by having these stories up at the moment that I don't want to live with. So, for my sake and my family's sake, if you could take them down. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Tony, I would like to thank you for today's conversation, for your willingness to, you talk with me, for everything you do, for who you are. Keep on doing what you do. Um, yeah, and all the best. It's great stuff that you do. So,
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And this has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to be on
mhm,
here with you. Thank you for the invitation.
well, thank you. Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.